Welcome, everyone, to the final episode of Urban Equity Chats. My name is Andre Darmanin. I am the host of it, and of course, and I work with Urban Equity Consulting here in, basically in Canada, but global. And I like to start off by talking about, what we're going to be discussing here, and it's going to be on equity and inclusion in sports organizations. And we're going to have a conversation about how we got here and now what we need to do in terms of bringing that within sports organizations itself, not just sports itself as an entity, but also how are organizations doing this, and what do we need to do further in order to have this happen. So I like to first introduce my guests today. First, I have Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique. She's the executive director of the Institute of Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change, and an associate professor at San Jose State University. Welcome, Dr. Akilah. And thanks. And of course, for those who are in Toronto, there's no need for any introduction, but if you don't, Justin Morrow is right now, he's the technical development manager at Toronto FC. And he just retired last year as a member of Toronto FC's Toronto FC, and also just a little bit about him too. He was an MLS champion with Toronto FC back in 2017. My God, 5 years already. and after all of the events of 2020, he was one of the people behind the MLS Black Players for Change. And we'll get more into his initiative and what he's doing at Toronto FC throughout the webcast. So welcome, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Andre. Hey, everybody.
So, all right. So let's begin here today. Usually, I kind of have the land acknowledgement, which we do here in Canada and some places in the U.S. So I like to first start off with a land acknowledgement. And so, as a settler, I am on the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and the purchase of 1792, and the Between the Lakes purchase of 1792. So with that, we'll get started with our conversation. So here we are. We've had a lot of events happen over the last couple of years with the murder of George Floyd. We continuously see murders happening. Of course, Dr. Akilah would be familiar with Dr. Fry, and I've seen a lot of her conversation around suicides within sports. So, and of course, a lot of that some of it has to do with racial trauma. And also intergenerational trauma, so that we have effects of that, and so that's a conversation that we can have in terms of the sports industry itself. But also, what I'd like to talk about here during our hour conversation is what are organizations doing to alleviate that and to promote a positive message for within their organizations and also for the sports world itself. So I'd like to start off here by, first, we'll get into the introductions here and telling us about themselves, why they got into this work, and even talk about their lived experiences here. So first, I'd like to start off with Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique. Just basically, like I said, tell us about yourself and why you got into this work, and tell us about your lived experiences with this.
Yes. Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. Sometimes I'm a little bit taken aback that, people ask and to be on programs. Even still, it's one where I think because I live at these intersections of like race and gender and being a student athlete, kind of under that construct of being told, much like LeBron James, shut up and dribble, throughout my lifetime. It's been one where you're still kind of surprised, but also appreciative. So again, thank you for having me on the program today. Who I am? Well, Akilah Carter-Francique. I was born and raised in Topeka, Kansas in the US. to parents that were K-12 educaters, there are HBCU alum, individuals that were recruited to Topeka, Kansas, in many ways to help live out the Brown v. Board of Education legislation. So if you're familiar with that in that US context, it was, again, slow and steady. And, it was one where they, in those educational spaces, did a lot of work as classroom teachers, as special education instructors, as academic counselors, later moved on in their career up into upper administration. And so that, I think, in many ways sort of shaped my upbringing, being in those spaces and places, hearing the conversations over the table, seeing the students that they work with when I go to school and tag along, if you will. And that ushered me also into this space of sport. One, I'm asthmatic, so child can't breathe. But with that, the doctor was like, you got to get involved in some physical activity. And so track was the thing. I also was in ballet. I was also in martial arts. But I followed in the footsteps of my older brother, who later went on to go to the University of Florida and compete in track and field. I soon followed along and went to the University of Houston and competed, double major there, had the great opportunity to train under Tom Tellez and then Leroy Burrell, which I think we'll kind of come back to that in some conversation a little bit when we talk about student athlete trauma. But with that said, got educated in that space and learned a lot in that space by being a team captain, a peer mentor, my own educational training in psychology and also Kines exercise science, and the lived experience as a student athlete, knowing that we were often put in a precarious position because on one level, we want you to be the face of the university, but on another level, we just need you to perform. And so sort of living at those intersections, seeing those things, I will have to say I was really supported by the university, the athletic department, and being that peer mentor and using my voice and being able to speak up. And so all of that, I think, drove me into the space of eventually navigating over to the University of Georgia, where I received my master's in Kines exercise science and later my doctorate in sports studies, studying under Dr. Billy Hawkins, who's now at the University of Houston, which is so crazy. And so we had the opportunity to continue to do that work. But one of the things I noticed during my doctoral studies, as I was examining sort of the lived experiences, looking at retirement and transition, in many ways trying to figure out my life, because I always say I do me search. I noticed that in those books, in those chapters, in those journals, there were not stories of Black women and those Black female athletes. And so that began my journey even more so into this scholarship to amplify, first of all, to uncover, and then to amplify the stories of Black female student athletes. And so from there, I've just taken those works and that studying into various institutions, Texas A&M University, and I'm going to say a historically white university, Prairie View A&M University, and HBCU, now at San Jose State, which is a minority serving institution with a Hispanic serving designation, leading, I hope, this Institute for the Study of Sports, Society, and Social Change that was developed, created by the Dr. Harry Edwards, many know as the architect for the Olympic Project of Human Rights, and also serving as that associate professor in that department, teaching classes, teaching students, engaging in this notion of social movement, social change, and uplift.
All right, thank you for that. Justin, your turn.
Ooh, I'm not sure I want to follow that. I think I just want to. I just want to listen to you speak the whole time, Dr. Carter. Seriously, it's amazing, and I'm just happy to be in your presence. Like, I don't know how I got to where I am today. I'll take you guys a little bit through it, but it definitely wasn't by design. More just through lived life experiences. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. My father, a Black man, was a police officer for Cleveland Police for over 25 years. My mother, a white Irish lady, a school teacher for, to this day, over 30 years now. And we grew up middle class in Cleveland, which was at that time, late 80s, early 90s, still a city very divided by race. And I was just in the middle of it, never really feeling comfortable on either side. But the thing that kept me going was sports. That was everything in my family. My father, he was the first in his family to go to university. He went to Ohio University. He was a Bobcat, and he got there through wrestling. So he got a scholarship for wrestling, and that allowed him some upward mobility, and in turn he wanted to give that to me. And so much of our relationship was built around sports, and I used to play every sport. Soccer eventually was the one that stuck, but I used to play everything and watch everything. And so on top of it, like being a thing in our family, it was also like a Midwest thing. It's very, Cleveland is a sports town. So I'll be watching the Browns, watching the Cavs, watching the Indians. I would be watching high school sports, and my father would take me to wrestling meets, and he would take me to high school basketball. And the way he, would teach me values was through sports. So we'd watch local kids who were coming up through high school, doing really well, going off to college, and he'd be like, "Look, you got to look at that guy. You got to be like him," or "Look at that guy. Look how he's failing. You don't want to be like him. He's messing up off the field." So that's how a lot of my values were passed on to me. And so that soccer, like I said, soccer stuck for me and ended up taking me places. I went to a big Catholic prep school in Cleveland called Cleveland St. Ignatius. It's one of these feeder schools that has like elite, education, talent, sports talent, and sends them to different universities. And so in that space, it was majority Caucasian students, and I was in the minority, both on the soccer field and the classroom. And I felt that, I received microaggressions. I also received death threats. But because I was supported by my family so well, and because things were going well for me, I was able to brush it aside and just keep it moving. But I think it was very formative for me, because I was like, okay, at some point I'm going to use this, for positive. I'm going to change this negative experience into positive. So I took that to Notre Dame, where also, large Caucasian student body, and again felt that in my life, and joined and helped start the local chapter of the NAACP, just to build a community. And that was like the first leadership and part of community that I was able to be involved in. And then I jumped into professional sports, and I ended up having a very long career. And towards the end of my career, George Floyd happens, and all the Black players in Major League Soccer are trying to figure out how do we organize. And I was a big part of that, along with a good leadership team. And we launched this, what is now a nonprofit organization. And I think about the time, because it's such a big time in my life. I think about the 2 years that has passed, and it's just crazy to me that I ended up where I am today. But on top of my job that I'm very grateful to have here with Toronto FC and player development, I'm heavily involved in organizing professional athletes to fight for equality in our sports, to fight for equity in our communities. And that's heavy on my heart and my mind right now.
Wow, that was a really, really heartfelt message there, Justin. I didn't know that much about you. I mean, other than our conversation before, but this is something that from the both of you, it was really good conversation and listening to your lived experiences, and that's what drew me to have this conversation. So, going into what we've just talked about and leaning into that a little bit. Yes, we've started to, the tipping point was George Floyd, but social change didn't start from there. It's always been happening, and it's always been there, but sports organizations, as a whole, did not act on that. We saw a history of it. And so I want to go into that a little bit more to provide the audience with a little bit of context in terms of, not necessarily where we got to from 2020, but how did we get here? What has been going on, and how have organizations dealt with it in the past or addressed it in the past? So, Dr. Akilah, you're well versed in this. Just give us a little bit of a context as to how we've gone to this point, and and basically just talk about why why organizations haven't made that change up until now, at least up until now?
Well, I think in many ways, if we look at sporting spaces, it's one of sort of this meritocracy because you compete, and those that compete well make the team. And so it's one of those things that begins to, in some ways, weed out individuals and understand or recognize that people sort of earn their place there. And so sport is also, as we say, this microcosm of society. It sort of reflects a lot of the behaviors, the isms, the inequities, the stereotypes, and in many ways also amplifies those in that space as well. And so we see these organizations, whether they'll be, local community organizations, on into our high school experiences, as Justin talked about, living in those high school communities. I too went to an all-white high school. And what does that mean when you're like one of 7 children or seven athletes there? It was quite interesting. Just a quick aside, I remember in high school, we went to a track meet, beginning of the year, took part of the team. And with that, we're at a meet, warming up, sitting in the stands, some other Black athletes run around, and they came up to us. Again, all of us are Black as well. And they said, "You guys are so lucky you go to a Black school." And we said, no, don't get it twisted. We are the Black kids at the school. They were like, "Oh." So it was almost this notion of, oh, you're so great, to be in that space, but also not even realizing that some of us are small, small groups, small collectives in those organizations. That oftentimes gets reaffirmed if we begin to move up into the college levels, again, depending on sport. Looking at the work of Dr. Richard Lapchick at the University of Central Florida and the Tides Institute, he puts out these reports that began to help us understand where we are in racial representation within those organizations. And so again, this notion of meritocracy, we see how educational inequities sort of manifest. We begin to see how economic inequities manifest in those spaces about who's in what sport, right? What position they have in those organizations. Are we athlete or are we coach? Are we administrator? Are we in the C-suites? Are we owner? And so we begin to see, as we look at those particular statistics, that data begins to help us understand where we are. Understanding those notions and being in those particular spaces and places, again, like I said, those isms begin to be reaffirmed in those spaces. So when we talk about racism and power dynamics, we see how that's sort of reflected. Again, I spoke about Dr. Billy Hawkins and his great work talks about this notion of even the oscillating migrant laborer and how athletes move from place to place. We're in the middle of the draft, right? It started yesterday. We're seeing athletes sort of get recruited or selected based on talent. They're having to move and uplift themselves and move from place to place. So we start to see this notion sort of leaning on history during those sort of plantation times, reaffirm itself in these sporting spaces, notion of owner, laborer, and what that means in that particular dynamic. What that also means as well is that the voices that are at the top are often those of the dominant voice, of the voices of power. And so, and the standard. And with that said, do we need to change anything? Because we are just mirroring our society. We are the most dominant voices. We are the most important voices. And so those that are often marginalized are often the labor that don't have the power, that don't have the economic means. And so these things become reaffirmed, embedded, and in many ways couched as tradition. We've always done it this way. We don't know how to do it any other way. And so with that said, we see how easily that organizations, sport organizations, in this conversation as well, can begin to just maintain that modus of operation, right? To play the game, because it's about the sport. It's not about the social issues outside of that. You're here to play, we're here to win, and we're also here to make money. And we're not going to mess up that dynamic in these contexts. And so that's where sort of sport organizations have come into play. Now we're in a space, and I know we'll go into that conversation of, we're starting to be, those organizations are being held accountable because those athletes, those individuals realize that they have a power and they have a community and they have a voice and the ability to make those changes.
And thank you for that. That was excellent and poignant to speak of all that. So now I want to go to you, Justin. So I want to talk about your professional career, not just Toronto FC, but also San Jose and whatnot. So going through your playing career, your professional career, what did you notice? We can even go back to your college career as well as at Notre Dame. Like, what did you experience during those times that you were playing? Did you, was there any experiences of racism, inequities? Did you experience all of that? And what kind of things led you to this point of at this point of your career with the murder of George Floyd? So take us back a little bit to tell us about what got you here and what experiences you had as a professional.
Yeah, I would start with the context that soccer in North America is a pay-to-play sport. And so it's very expensive. And when you start with that, you're automatically recognizing that you're going to exclude a lot of minorities, a lot of marginalized people. So in anything that I was doing at whatever level, I was always in the minority of Black people on the team. Whatever team I was on, there was 2 to 3 Black kids, like maximum. And that was my experience in club soccer, in high school soccer, college soccer, and changed a little bit when I got to professional, but still definitely in the minority. And so when you start with that, I think the thing that I faced most was just, structural systemic issues that led to feeling uncomfortable. I never had a Black coach until I was halfway through my career. And I noticed the change in me. I noticed the effect that it had on my career right away. Being able to share something with somebody outside of details of the sport really matters in terms of development, in terms of learning. So that was a huge experience for me. But most of all, it was systemic barriers and systemic issues that I noticed right on from the bottom to the top of the system, and something that we're trying to fight for today. So yeah, I think like I said, at times there were some microaggressions, some jokes that flew that not were malintended, but didn't land very well with me. And those are things that you change with a cultural awareness. Also something that we're trying to change and implement today. But in terms of the standout racist moment that I received in high school, there wasn't anything like that in the professional ranks, and I'm happy for that. And it shows what our starting point is now at the moment, where we have to go. But overall, by the time 2020 came around, the thing that was bubbling under the surface in Major League Soccer was there was a couple of racist incidents that had happened around the league. Most notably in Cincinnati, there was a coach fired in February of 2020 for using the N-word in the locker room, and he had been throwing around the N-word for a couple of months. And the thing that I always highlight is that the players, this was known around the league. Like, I knew about it 6 months before it came to public light. And so for those players in that locker room to feel uncomfortable, and for other guys in the league to know about it for that long and not be acted on, not really come to light, just shows how uncomfortable Black players really felt at that time, because they didn't feel comfortable going to the Players Association, because they didn't think that they would handle it the correct way. They didn't feel appropriate going to the league because they didn't think they would handle it the correct way. So there was nowhere really for them to turn. And so they just sat with it for a while and expressed their discontent through relationships that they had throughout the league. So I really like to highlight those types of things that were happening specifically in Major League Soccer at the time. Other things that happened are, the N-word getting thrown around on the field and it not being resolved at the management level. it's with the processes that they have in place, it kind of end up as a he said, she said type of thing. And they weren't willing to indict somebody on a somebody else's word. So you kind of end up in a stalemate where the person who's been offended is just holding the bag at the end of the day with no recourse. And so again, these are a couple of the things that are happening in Major League Soccer right before George Floyd in 2020, which ultimately made it that boiling point, as you said, for us.
And this is an interesting case because in between all that we've discussed, one of the one of the points or one of the social change, what's happened with social change is we saw this Rooney Rule, right, which was supposed to be allowing for NFL players to for Black NFL players to advance within the ranks of the league and creating equity and racial equity within the NFL. But also too, there was still some racism that was happening within the NFL, and a lot of them ended up coming up to Canada to play because there was a little bit more equity there. So that was something that that's, as I've grown up and I've learned about this is something that I've seen. I mean, Dr. Akilah, you probably are a little bit more familiar with the Rooney Rule, and has it really even leveled the playing field of say NFL, or has it even permeated into other sports, or at least the sports organizations as we speak? So if you want to talk about that a little bit.
The Rooney Rule was designed as a way to serve as, in some ways, an affirmative action, an opportunity for those coaches of color, Black coaches in particular, to be able to be interviewed by these respective organizations, be in the pool and being considered. When it did start, I believe it was around 2003, there was an uptick, an increase in the hiring of those coaches, but over about a decade, things have waned. The numbers and the percentages are back down again. And it's disheartening in many ways, because again, if you go to the work of Lapchick and looking at those statistical representations of who are the potential, because it's not who are the potential coaches that could be in these pools, there's ample number of coaches of color, of Black coaches that are available to navigate into these head coaching positions. So what we then have to begin to look at is what is going on, to Justin's point, to the culture of those respective sports, football in particular, because we're focusing on the Rooney Rule, but even as we think of Major League Soccer, even as we think of baseball, even as we think of our college sporting spaces. And so there's something going on in that culture where those systemic notions of racism, of sexism, are allowed to fester and perpetuate in such a manner that even with a candidate being interviewed, they're still not selected. They're still not deemed as viable. They're still not deemed as individuals that are a fit for that organization. Owners have something to do with that, right? The individuals in those C-suites have something to do with that decision. And so we have to begin to sort of look at those individuals that are running those organizations and the culture that has been allowed to be created in that space that would in some ways sort of box out, again, viable, qualified, talented coaches of color. We know Brian Flores is going through, and went through all of that as well. Many other coaches have, because also what comes to mind is if a Black coach gets in that position, to be quite honest, if they mess up or the organization feels that they messed up or didn't meet the goal or the standard that was set, they're let go. And the opportunity for rehire is almost out the window. So we oftentimes see them returning or going into college sports to kind of coach in those spaces. And so it's very challenging. There is that culture there that's festering. There is those traditions there. But what comes to it is being able to tap into that ownership and begin to sort of see, well, where is their mindset when it comes to understanding the notions of equitable, equitability, understanding and recognizing the importance of culture, of being anti-racist in many of these ways. So we have those rules, but again, the Rooney Rule is there, but who are holding, what is the accountability factor? What is the deterrent to make sure that it is a legitimate interview, that is a legitimate review of that candidate to come into that space? And that's where we have to begin to sort of look at need to redress many of the policies within the NFL, within those respective organizations, to ensure that there's some sort of compliance and accountability placed upon those individuals.
And, not just only to talk about anti-racist efforts of organizations. Justin, you're probably, or both of you are probably familiar with the situation in Portland that festered probably over the last year, where there were calls for sexual harassment from the ownership, right? So, and there was no accountability until someone decided, actually not just someone, but a whole group of women decided to say enough was enough. Even the Portland Timbers Club, the supporters of the Timbers, they actually had calls to action too. So there was a grassroots movement, just like we saw with other organizations, including Black Players for Change. There was that grassroots, but within the organization itself. So we're starting to see that these are happening, and that people are rising and saying enough is enough with the sexism, the homophobia, the inequalities and inequities that are occurring within sport. So aside from all of that, first of all, we can talk about the grassroots. For instance, with Justin, we can talk about the precipice for Black Players for Change, but also what should these organizations be doing to create more equity, for social equity, and also bringing it to the grassroots of saying, what's their influence and how are they influencing the grassroots in order to make sports equitable? Because of course, as Justin had talked about, in his situation, growing up and whatnot. So how do we make sports organizations be more equitable? So Justin, let's start with you with talking about Black Players for Change. And we know that the movement started with George Floyd, but there has to be some, what are the actions that you're looking to accomplish with this?
Yeah, I mean, that's a $1 million question right there in terms of how do sports organizations make themselves and their communities more equitable. I think the couple things that I would focus on are number one, cleaning up their own house, in terms of culture. I think Dr. Carter spoke to it very well, but in terms of these hiring practices, they're just a starting point, but you can implement anything you want and nothing will change unless the culture changes. And that's through having people there whose hearts and minds fully believe that diversity in all realms is a good thing for the company. Because if the people at the top don't truly believe that, then they'll find ways around these rules. They'll find ways around it. So for all of the sports leagues and teams themselves, I'm saying that the number one thing they have to do is clean themselves up from an internal perspective. Yeah, that's hiring, but also it's just culture, what you stand on, what's the balance between profit and impact. Like if we can find a middle ground in terms of wanting to make an impact instead of just making $1 at every corner, then I think the mindset around the organization starts to shift a little bit. So I would start with that. I would also start with maybe understanding the landscape a little bit more for each organization in each league. I think teams feel that they need to touch on every single issue, but what does it mean to really go deep on one issue? There's a lot of education that's needed in terms of systemic issues instead of just throwing money at a problem, which you see a lot of these days, especially from the leagues. Like there's $100 million is the new is the new thing. Everybody's got $100 million for something, and it's for social justice causes or whatever. But really understanding what it would take to make an impact, and then going in one lane on that. I think that would help in terms of efficiency, and then collaboration. I think that's the other thing. I think both teams and leagues are jumping into things without assessing who's already doing things and how much better off they'd be if they partnered with other organizations that are already doing the work, both inside and outside of sport. There's just, since I've been in the space, I get connected to somebody new like once a week who's doing good work, and I think that they need to work with each other in a greater fashion to be able to make greater leaps and bounds. So those are the three things that I see that they could do better.
Dr. Akilah, so what are you seeing on the ground right now, not only with the university and the work that you're doing, but also within your research? What are you seeing right now, or what are you seeing that needs to happen for these owners or for the directors of these amateur associations? What are you seeing happening right now?
I think at the onset of, I guess, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw those statements of solidarity, and then organizations kind of going in and doing some things, but in many ways, some of that was performative. And I say that because as we look 2 years later, what has been done that's substantive, that can be deemed as very authentic in their investment in that statement that they made, and holding them accountable for those things that they said, as far as representation, as far as being able to, amplify voices, or doing the collaboration as Justin talked about. But I think one of the things that I see that needs to happen is really doing a deep dive, doing an overhaul of that particular organization. I had the great opportunity to work with Dr. Ellen Starowski and Algerian Hart in a forthcoming book on diversity, equity, inclusion in sport, and put forth a chapter that speaks to what's happened over these past 2 years, as well as look at the role of advocacy and activism in that space, and provide some sort of best practices. And what I talk about are some takeaways, are much along the line of what Justin said, to the notion of doing a diversity audit, being able to understand where your organization is at, looking at and taking taking out concentrated time and effort to see where are we at as an organization from a statistical standpoint, looking at the data and the representation of who we have in these respective offices, what that personnel looks like, understanding, as we talk about, sort of their intersectionality, their race, their gender, sexual orientation, if it's forthcoming, religion, if it's forthcoming, and educational level, years of experience, et cetera. Then once we go through that point, go into this notion of examining or re-examining the policies that have been put forth. Because just as much as one is inspired to make change or feels compelled to, their heart's in the right place, policies have been written in such a way that we can overlook and not really understand some of the barriers that have been put in place based on the language of, or based on the processes of. So re-examining those policies, working with, this is part of the collaboration that's necessary as well, working with organizations that do those anti-racist work or anti-sexist work, to be able to come in and look at the policies that are written to see how they need to be rewritten to ensure equitable processes towards recruitment, hiring, retention, promotion in those spaces and places. Next, after data and policy, is looking at the practice, the methods that are utilized, or the programs that are utilized to sort of move people forward. Again, what are some roadblocks there, and how can we work to promote this notion of inclusion? And then finally, after looking at that, it all will then speak to the culture, and you'll begin to see a shift, because you have things in place that are holding individuals accountable in such a way that you can shift the culture to be able to create equitable practices and policies that allow for a diverse body of individuals to be in that space, to represent and to be able to uplift and move that organization forward, still meeting its economic, bottom line, but really enhancing the quality and the experience of individuals in that organization from bottom to top. When we talk about having an organization that is culturally competent and having an organization that brings forth a sense of community and a sense of belonging. And that's what I see organizations needing to move towards. But I see a lot of challenges in that because this is how we've done it this whole time. And they're not leaning on the fact that there are experts in the field, in sports spaces, outside of sports spaces, that do this work when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion.
All right, great. That's an excellent segue here, and I did mention in the chat that people can unmute themselves or just ask a question. So I have a question here from Deborah Machado. She's actually talking to us from Brazil. So her question is: are both of you receiving resistance from sports organizations the more you get into advocacy for best practices, equity, and inclusion? If yes, what would be the main resistant behavior? So Justin, I think I can let you answer that question, and then Dr. Akilah, you can go ahead with that.
Yes, I would say. Well, I would start with the fallout that I've seen most from 2020 is in corporations, leagues, and teams. Like there's an explosion of DEI roles, like head of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and then sometimes if the organization is actually about it, they'll give that person a team, of people underneath them to work with and resources to actually get something done. And so in those ways, that's positive, because now you have people within these places that are doing this work 9 to 5 every day. And I've seen in Major League Soccer some advances because of that. I've seen some cultural change, but at the end of the day, they are still on a silo themselves within the greater part of the organization, and they only have so much say. And so when it comes to them pushing against the larger organization, the rubber always meets the road at some point. And I think that's where we've seen the resistance. So in some ways we've been able to make some small wins, but once you really start asking for some real wins, then I think that's the resistance that we've met. And again, that goes to the people at the top of the organization. What do they really believe in this? And I think I'm trying to rack my brain here for some concrete examples. And I think MLS, they implemented the hiring initiative in February of this year, and that is like the Rooney Rule. MLS didn't have anything like that before, so now they're saying, okay, we want to take a step forward. But I think everyone who saw and was part of making that realized that this is only a small fraction of what we actually need to make change, but this is what we can get through right now, because this is what the team governors are comfortable with. When actuality, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And so I just give that example as a reference to say that we've met resistance in some type of way. We've also been able to make some small gains, and I think we're still yet to see the full effect of 2020 and how everything is going to play out, because a lot of people are just getting themselves established in these roles. And there was this flurry of movement. And the thing that I always say is that people just really threw the kitchen sink at it. We're going to do this and this and this, and put out a statement. We're going to do programming, and we're going to give money. And I think very few people actually know what's working and what's not working yet. So we still have to have a greater understanding of that. and we still have to find ways to continue to move it along in a faster step than we have. So yeah, that definitely have met resistance so far.
Dr. Akilah?
Ditto all of Justin. And I really appreciate you saying that kitchen sink. I mean, I'm seeing people, I'm like, what are we doing? We can't do all of this. We don't have the bandwidth to do this. We saw the onslaught of diversity webinars. I was part of that, either through my own institute or collaborating with others. You know, you throw out something, you can find a diversity webinar and get that information. But again, that true change comes with being strategic, as they're strategic with marketing, as they're strategic with other efforts when we talk about building, you know, that economic bottom line. And so as much as organizations are bringing forth individuals in DEI positions, we saw it with the Broncos, I talk about China Jews, saw it with the Lakers, it's one where everything needs to change from top to bottom, but we have to really sort of go into these spaces and be strategic with it, because everything does not fit in some of these spaces and places. It needs to come in such a way that it's part of sort of the natural day-to-day. I have the great opportunity to work with one of the Major League Soccer teams currently, the San Jose Earthquakes, conducting what I call social change training, looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion with their youth sport academy, starting them young, but also working with that front office. But again, we have to be mindful. Yes, you can have these individuals in these roles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, vice presidents, if you will. But if there's no resources thrown behind that, then it's in many ways all for naught. And that individual is going to eventually be burned out, as we've seen in corporate America as well. So to Justin's point, being able to have more than one staff, meaning themselves, to put forth some of these initiatives, being able to have the financial resources, right? But also the time. I think some people don't think about the time that is also needed to engage in some of these activities, because now that we're coming out of pandemic, for those of those that think a pandemic happened, now that we're coming out of pandemic, we're going back to business as usual, continuing the hustle and bustle, and continuing the way that we operated, and not sort of infusing in this new aspect of it. The last thing I'll say is that in some spaces, maybe not so much in the professional lines, but even more so in college sports, which I'm in that realm as well, we've seen this creation of a diversity and inclusion officer. It's like a designee. And so it was almost an add-on. You've got to add this on to your duties now. Not being trained, not being educated, not knowing the ins and outs and all of the intersections that their students live at, from a race, gender, social class, learning disability, a geographic location as an international student, those challenges, and it becomes an extra addition. So the need to also not only, and I think in many ways, maybe take a line from some of these, again, corporate organizations and professional teams, to have a person that is designated to do that work. But at the same time, it's very isolating. Those individuals need to have a seat at the table and not just be a part of the team, but have a seat at the table to be able to help guide those leaders in those respective organizations and infuse this work and these efforts into the day-to-day practices of all those from top to bottom.
And you know, and it actually, as you were talking, I was, and Justin too, going back to the whole fan experience too, and how that becomes a point where for action for change as well. So I mean, and also community organizations or community groups. So a couple of things come to mind is, number one, Justin, you're fully aware of our BIPOC fan coalition, who have started to, before MLSE, Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, for those in the audience, went down this road. They were in front of it, but we want to see what the fan experience was like in terms of bringing access, bringing equity, bringing rooting out the racism within the stands. So to have a full experience of why we can, or how we can better allow for that experience of watching a game even, right? Because we support our players, but yet what we see within the stands is something that we that we experience, and does not make a family experience better, does not make the experience for those where you're trying to create equity within just watching a game itself. And also too, I want to credit somebody, and I'm sorry to put him on the spot, but Drew Ebanks. I've known him on social media for quite some time, and he runs a community organization called On Point Basketball, where he highlights a lot of the kids going through prep school, a lot of and highlighting their the need and putting them out there in terms of talent. So Drew's going to speak about that, and I want him to talk about that and what his experiences are as well, just to kind of make this conversation a little bit better. So Drew, go ahead, man.
Thanks a lot, Andre. Appreciate it. I didn't know I was going to speak. I was more just trying to listen and just take it in. But yeah, it's just a matter of obviously living in Canada. We're living in a hockey country. So for me, it was just trying to figure out how to get more exposure for a lot of the kids that were having successes down in the States. And there was a whole bunch of them that were having success, but the stories weren't being told, especially in the mainstream. There was a time when I worked for Global Television, which is one of the major networks. And, that was another thing where we wanted to kind of get some basketball stories on there. So that's kind of where my mission came from. And then I just realized also working part-time at a place called Hoop Dome that we had access to a lot of the kids coming through, the Anthony Bennett's, the Tyler Ennis's, the Andrew Wiggins. And so basically I just had my point and shoot camera and just turned it on them and asked them questions, and noticed when we put that up on YouTube that there was a lot of views, happening. And we were like, wow, we're on to something. So from there, just kind of developed On Point Basketball. It's actually our 10th anniversary of just putting kids, out there, letting people know the mainstream about these basketball successes. And it's grown so much in the 10 years, also shout out North Pole Hoops, NPH, and my guys over there, Elias and Tarek. We all came up at the same time. And now you see a lot of media out there covering the sport of basketball, all these young cats, young ladies, young men, with cameras, with videography skills, with editing, with graphical skills, and really, taking it up another level. And, even things as rec leagues, Mega City Basketball, and now the Brody Rec League coming up, and they're really making even regular basketball players feel like they're in the NBA. So it's just great to see the growth in Canadian basketball. And there's still, I can't even cover everything. There's still so many incredible stories. We have a women's league coming up. Shout out to Hoop Queens, a women's semi-pro league, I believe it is, coming. And that is an incredible accomplishment. And there's so many things happening. We recently did a Pro Can Invitational, which was to highlight the graduating U Sports, NCAA, CCAA players, put them in a combine setting where they had a chance to show themselves in front of scouts, NBA scouts, CEBL administrators, and European scouts. And, just to try to give them an opportunity, and we'll have several signings to pro leagues out of that weekend. So the whole sport of basketball is just maturing here in Canada. It's growing. The talent is there. The coaching talent is incredible. Where I think we're lagging, and I have to deal with this, we do some content with Sportsnet as well. And, they've been great for us. But what I would say is, even with Sportsnet, trying to secure sponsors to back our projects has been not easy at all. And I think that's where things need to change. The corporate culture in Canada has to support basketball the way they support hockey, because the sport's a global sport. And so we shouldn't have a tough time bringing in on sponsors to back us financially for a sport so big, and a sport that Canadians are having so much success. 24 players hit the NBA. We've got about 3 or 4 ladies in the WNBA, which is so hard to make. And more are coming to the NBA. A lot are playing overseas, both women and men, and NCAA basketball as well. So I think the corporate side that has to step up, because we can't continue to do these kind of things on our own. I mean, I've been doing On Point basketball essentially on my own funding. And so for me, I'm looking at ways to kind of get over that hump and get that corporate support. So thank you guys for giving me the time. I wasn't expecting to talk, Andre, but really appreciate this chat here.
All right, great. Thanks, Drew. I mean, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I couldn't with the conversation that we had. So I really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Drew, for your commentary in terms of, how to grow the game and make it more accessible for Canadians itself, and not only going towards hockey, because hockey, of course, they're going through their own issues when it comes to raising equity within the sport, and we've seen countless times with racism in hockey itself. So I want to conclude our conversation today, but just basically just saying, we've talked about our calls to action here. So how I want to just end this conversation today is, Dr. Akilah, Justin, so what do you see moving forward? And as well, just tell us what you're doing in your careers, and just tell us about where we can find you on social media or on the internet.
Want me to go first? All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I am, like I said, I'm in this space now where I'm helping professional athletes and teams and leagues organize in this issue, in this area. But first, I'm doing a deeper dive myself. I was a business major in school, and I didn't learn a lot of the things that I'm learning until now. And so, hooking up with people like Dr. Carter, who can point me in the right direction of what to study, what to read, history. Like, there's so much that learning about, post Civil War Reconstruction and how that's still affecting us today, or learning about the civil rights movement and who are the key players and how did they, not just about the landmark moments, but how did they strategically achieve racial desegregation, or all of these different issues. Like, really understanding that will give you more depth when you're going into these rooms, because racism a lot of times is a hard thing to explain if you don't have that as a weapon. It's kind of like going into a fight with your arm cut off. Like, you're trying to get the words out, you're trying to explain someone the experience, but for someone who doesn't have it, it's not going to come across without that. So that's what I personally have been diving into, like taking classes, doing projects. And I still have a long way to go with that, but it's helping me out a lot. And so I would encourage not only everyone here, but specifically athletes. Like, I'm always going to be harder on them, that they need to get up on this stuff, because it's really what's going to make the difference in their advocacy and their activism to make it that much more effective. So that's where I'm at. You can find me on socials at just Morrow, and I'm front and center.
Thanks, Justin. Dr. Akilah?
Yeah, well, let me do the social media thing first, because I always forget. You can find me via obviously Twitter and Instagram at Dr. Francique. So DOCTA and then Francique. Of course, at San Jose State University, through my email there, akilah.carter-francique@sjsu.edu. Our Institute for the Study of Sports, Society, and Social Change. You can definitely find the work that we're doing there with our fabulous interns and colleagues, faculty affiliates, and faculty advisory board as well, through our conferences and our Sport Conversations for Change monthly webinars that we put on. And then my husband and I have an organization called Francique Sport and Education, where basically we take that same thing and do those consulting bits and work with, he's a professional coach, works with elite athletes in track and field as well. But I think as far as I talk about sort of next steps for me or who I work with, I'm gonna probably end the conversation much like I started. Again, I said my parents are K-12 educators, worked in Topeka, Kansas. They did their work for those students and those young people in those schools. Education is my activism as well. Teaching on a day-to-day basis, pouring into the students that are in my class, teaching them in this course I'm currently teaching on race, sport, activism, and social movements, so they can learn about race and racism, learn about some of those historical civil rights movements and those efforts when we think about, yes, the Olympic Project for Human Rights, but also to learn about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the work of Ella Baker and how she organized. They're learning this notion of social action. They're learning this notion overall of civic engagement. My goal is to pour back into those young people, because they are the ones that are having to manage the microaggressions that Justin and I had to do when we were young kids. I've got young kids myself, and I started training them and educating them at a young age, the age of 3, so they would have some armor going into these spaces and places to know how to cope with and respond to the engagements and interactions. It's up to our young people at this point. You know, we're working with them. Yes, we try with those that are older, but those are some habits and some traditions that are going to be tough to break down. But pouring into these young people that are going to be our next athletes, to Drew's point of being able to see themselves on the field, on the court, in the rink to play, is very important. To be able to be the next coaches, the next administrators, pouring into them to even be the next social change agents, utilizing their platforms outside of the arena, but also inside the arena as well. So continue to educate, continue to share those best practices on how to get involved and how to, in many ways, make an impact, disrupt, and promote that social change.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Carter-Francique, and Justin, for this excellent conversation, something that we need to have. I really appreciated it. So thank you to the audience for listening in and your questions and your commentary, especially you, Drew. Thanks for everything. And and that ends actually the first season of Urban Equity Chats. And thank you everyone for taking part. So have a good day, everybody.